It's the greatest mystery in literary history. A divisive question with highly contested answers. Who was the writer behind the pen name William Shakespeare? Welcome to Don't Quill the Messenger. Here's your host, Stephen Sable.
Hey there, Quillers. Welcome back to another wonderful episode of our fabulous podcast. We hope that you have downloaded every episode, and if you haven't, go to don'tquillthepodcast.com, don'tquillthepodcast.com. On today's episode, we welcome back to the program Bonner Miller Cutting. She is a second-generation Oxfordian and the author of a wonderful new book called Necessary Mischief that explores some of the very unique aspects of the Shakespeare authorship question. Hello, Bonner.
Hello, Stephen.
So glad to have you, and I'm so glad to have this book, which I'm holding right here in my hands. And I know that it is a compilation of some of the very interesting research that you have conducted over the years and some of the presentations that you have made for the Shakespeare Oxford Fellowship in the past, now put in print and now available right here at our fingertips. Tell me, which one's your favorite?
That's an interesting question because I like them all. What I set out to do, and I did this about 15 years ago when I was really getting started with, I've been researching this subject for many decades before that, because as you know, I'm a very unusual position in being a second generation Oxfordian because my mother was so interested, and my father too. And she published 4 books on the subject. So I was going to conferences for a long time, and I was having conversations with her and hearing about all these other wonderful Oxfordians like Charlton Ogburn Jr. and Mark Anderson and all the wonderful people, the giants among us. And so I started to think about areas that I thought we needed to research more. A lot of research had been done and was being done, but I tried to pick areas that for some reason I didn't feel like were getting enough attention, but would be really interesting. And one of them that it really surprised me, I was going to conferences and I would ask people, how did you come to be an Oxfordian? What attracted you? And people would tell me, so many people said this, that, well, I was interested in the subject and I realized all the things that were wrong with a man from Stratford: no education, no books, no manuscripts, no letters. But what really did it for me is when I read his will. This individual has no documentation, basically, though, has a last will and testament. And I read it, and it was just so bad. I couldn't believe that the person who left this will is one and the same as the person who wrote the Shakespeare works.
And we have a great episode all about that we talked about. It was you and me and Professor Don Rubin, who's also been a returning guest on the program. And people can find that episode if they go to our site and download it. And that is also one of my very favorites as well.
Exactly. It was a lot of fun to do. To tell your audience listening to this, for me, it was like being in a baseball warm-up cage where balls were coming at me from you and from Don Rubin, just as fast and furious as I could possibly hit them back. And it was wonderfully fun and amazing, the things that the two of you thought to ask me. It's a rapid succession, and it was a lot of fun to do that. So since we've actually covered a lot of that, I suppose we shouldn't cover that again, unless it comes up tangentially. So there are other things that I that were preying on my mind, and one of them, another area, and in fact, every time I sit down to research something, I run into pay dirt. I hit pay dirt. And another area was this doggone £1,000 annuity that Queen Elizabeth paid our guy. Now, this is where the will deals with the other guy. This deals with our guy. And he was given £1,000 a year annually, that's why it's called an annuity, by Queen Elizabeth. And this has not been at all touched on by historians. In fact, it's been ignored by historians. And that is remarkable because this is an anomaly in Elizabeth's reign for all kinds of reasons.
Help our listeners equate exactly how much, because it has been mentioned in a couple of episodes, but not thoroughly explored or explained, especially not the way that your book does explore and explain it. But help us understand in modern times exactly how much money that is.
That's a good question, and I get asked that fairly frequently. And it's to give myself a little bit of a hedge around here. It's hard to say. Different historians at different time frames put different monetary amounts on it. But it's safe to say, although you'll find somebody who'll say it's a little more, a little less, and it's basically about $1 million a year in our money today, in good old-fashioned American dollars. That's a lot of money. What makes it so unusual, if Queen Elizabeth had been in the habit of giving that much money here and there to all kinds of people who did things for her, who served in her royal administration, if she did that on a regular basis, then it doesn't really matter how much it is. It's just not all that unusual. What makes this so incredibly unusual is that Queen Elizabeth hated to give money.
She was a stingy monarch who was fighting off a potential invasion from foreign lands and foreign countries who wanted her dead. I don't think she was in the habit of giving away money.
Well, this is the thing. She was notoriously a miser. She was a skinflint who did not pay people if she could possibly get out from. She'd promised to pay people, and some of her generals fighting her wars, she didn't pay them. She didn't pay her military people. They were dying of starvation because they couldn't get paid. There's a wonderful book, and in my book, I'm not going to go into it now because that's too much minutia for this. But I have lots of sources for what I'm telling you that are in my book in chapter 7, because it needs to be put in context. Elizabeth was a skinflint who did her darndest. In fact, one historian, I'll name his name, is Lawrence Stone, who's one of the greatest English historians of the 20th century. And he says that the one thing she hated to do was to give money from her royal exchequer. What she did when she had to give someone some wealth, she gave them preferments. She gave them offices from which they could, if they were smart, they could figure out how to make money. And the funny thing is Oxford, our guy, tried to get preferments. He tried to get about half a dozen of these preferments, and she denied them all. And that's what she did for people that she wanted to be nice to. And so it's perplexing that she is doing something that she basically never did. And to make matters worse, and more amazingly perplexing, is that she attached to all of this money two things. First of all, is she made it money, it was called a privy seal warrant, dormant. That word dormant meant that this money was going to roll on and on and on into perpetuity, year after year after year, until and unless she set out another order to stop it,
or unless the recipient dies, right?
It rolled until he died.
Right.
And actually, a year before that, when King James became king, after Elizabeth died, he renewed it. So it just continued. This thing rolled out of the exchequer, this money, for 18 years.
Now, if he doesn't renew it, does it end? Or or did he need to renew it? Did he have to renew it? Or is that in itself an interesting thing that he goes about the process of renewing it?
I understand that he had to renew it. Yes.
Okay.
I've been told that, and don't have the actual paperwork in my article. I've been told that he had to renew it and that he did renew it.
This is sort of like, if we were going to put it into like a modern American context, it's like an executive order of the president, right?
That would be a very good analogy. Yes. Definitely. And then there's something else about this thing that is incredibly strange, this £1,000 a year, which is an enormous amount of money. And bear in mind, before I tell you what this something else is, it's money she did not have. Her exchequer, she was broke. Queen Elizabeth was dead broke. It's recognized by historians, but they don't really harp on telling people. And one historian wrote that Queen Elizabeth was helplessly, hopelessly poor. So when I say she's giving money to this particular individual, it's money that she really doesn't have and should, by all rights, have way more significant reasons to be paying this to other people, which she doesn't do.
Well, the Spanish Armada is threatening down, right? She's got to build a navy and support an army. The lowlands, there's all kinds of stuff going on up there. The Pope has basically said anyone who executes her is free from sin. Like, she's under barrage. Money is important.
She is a very nervous, vulnerable woman trying to run a country that the rest of the world, then being Spain and basically, which was the greatest of the world powers at the time, wanted to capture. England and make it a Catholic country again. So she's a Protestant leader, basically under attack. And when this money starts, which is, and I'm sorry to give a date, I know dates bore people, but 1586, so Armada is going to come 2 years later in 1588. But in 1586, Elizabeth and her counselors knew that the Armada was underway. They knew that plans were well underway, and sure enough, the attack came. So when this money starts, it's a time when she's gone from being a weak and vulnerable in a weak and vulnerable position, but it's getting worse and worse and worse. And she's getting more and more in debt with less and less means to do anything with. So why in the world is she paying this money to this particular nobleman who, so far as we know, did not, so far as we know, do anything specifically to earn it? And one of the reasons we don't know what he did to earn it is because here's the craziest thing of all. She attached to this money a non-accountability clause. Oh my God.
Meaning what exactly? I mean, spell that out for us. A non-accountability clause means he doesn't have to give her a bill of sale. What does it really mean?
That is what it really means. Well, I'd like to know what it really means. And I have studied non-accountability clauses. I have a researcher in England that I had pull up every possible warrant. They call these things warrants. It's her order to pay somebody that could possibly have a non-accountability clause attached to it. And there were about 20 others. And they were all paid to people who we know what they were doing. And she says in these warrants what they were doing to earn it. But why he is getting this money with no accountability is a great mystery.
What are the potential motivations, do you think? Well, as objective as you could be, what are the potential motivations of this sovereign to suddenly grant this $1 million a year to a nobleman who, P.S., is known for squandering money left and right on everything he does? What could be the potential motivation?
And I want to reemphasize what you just said. Yes, historians, when they bring up his name, they regard him as a spendthrift and a ne'er-do-well and irresponsible, and a word they use often is feckless.
Well, he threw money around like water, like it was growing on trees.
So they tell us that is his reputation from historically, and I'm not sure it's quite as true as they tell you it is, but he does not have a historical reputation for being a good money manager. Now, bear in mind, he was an earl. And the Earl of Essex, and this was something that the earls were supposed to spend money to do good deeds. Except what we know that he spent money on was he spent money on literary people and people that were involved in theatrical things. But we don't know. We don't have enough details. For one thing, historians don't want to delve into things and give us enough details. But we Oxfordians are dredging up a lot of details about Edward de Vere and what he spent money on. But getting back to his historical reputation, he's not reported to have been a great money manager, although as an earl, that would not have been a requirement that was placed on him by the Queen. Still, she had many more people that were spending their money. She had the Earl of Essex was spending money right and left on military expeditions. The Earl of Cumberland was losing his fortune and in his properties and his earldom to do what was called privateering instead of pirateering. He was privateering to go out and was building ships and was spending enormous amounts of money to fight Spain on Elizabeth's behalf, to fight the great wealth of Spain and the great armadas and the ships of Spain, and to capture them and bring them back. So, and a number of people were trying to do this. So, but Oxford is not doing anything that we can identify that he could be doing to earn this money. He's not a diplomat. He's not going, her diplomats who went to France and Paris and to Venice, or diplomats, they always lost their shirt doing it because she never paid them enough to cover the expenses of their jobs. She was a skinflint.
But she's throwing $1 million a year at this guy. Was he just really good in bed and this was her pimp fee? What do you think? Was that the motivation?
I don't think so. There is thought, and I don't particularly agree with this, but I don't try to get into quarrels with people who do, that he had been romantically involved with her when he was young. when he was in his 20s. Now, that's not when this money started. This money started when he was actually 36 years old and lasted to the end of his life, as I said, being reissued by King James, and he died when he was 54. So that's actually, this money far postdates whatever affair he may or may not have had.
So she'd moved on to other lovers by then.
Oh, well, and actually, officially, the great Cambridge historians that we read don't believe that he was a favorite. We seem to think so, but if he was, it came and went rather quickly, and she actually ended up imprisoning him twice. And the story of his life is a really interesting and somewhat bizarre life story, wonderfully entertaining biography. But I don't really think supportive of a long-standing affair between Elizabeth and Edward de Vere. And another thing that's important to bear in mind, and not to get off the subject here, but she had a long-standing love affair with the Earl of Leicester.
And did she give him $1 million a year?
No, she did not give him $1 million a year. What she gave him were preferments that he could make money out of, which is how she rewarded the people.
Okay, so I'm just trying to go down the checklist here and check off things that might have been a motivation for her. Well, she didn't give it to him because he was going to invest it and do well with it. She didn't give it to him because he was a favored lover. She didn't give it to him for diplomatic reasons or to travel to other countries and represent the crown. What do we have left?
And she didn't give it to him for any sort of service in her royal administration that we know. I mean, for example, William Cecil Lord Burleigh was her Lord Treasurer. He was also the Master of the Wards. We can track his service in her administration down to the nth degree. And she didn't give it to him for any service that he might have been performing that was an official duty to the crown. And he was never a military man. He had a couple of short military stints, but that is nowhere close to being commensurate with this kind of money. And of course, is it reparations
for the money that the crown or that Lord Burleigh took from him while he was in wardship, do you think?
Elizabeth wasn't. This idea of reparations is sort of a modern idea. I don't think that idea would have ever crossed her mind. And to get this, now we're getting a little off the subject of authorship, but it does go deeply to the character of Elizabeth. And according to, again, I'll quote Lawrence Stone, the Princeton University historian, educated in Oxford, is an English historian, that he said the one thing that Elizabeth hated to give was money out of her exchequer.
Okay, so then what's the reason? What do you think?
Okay. A number of people think I'm not the first one to offer this, but I will quote, since the late, great United States Supreme Court Justice John Paul Stevens, who wrote a law review article on this authorship subject. And he says straightforwardly that she was paying him to basically what he says, she was paying him to rewrite the history of England and put it on the stage so that the people of England in this wartime would have a history that they could be proud of. It would bring out the patriotic spirit in them, and they would want to go to war to fight Spain. They would want to go to the Low Countries to fight Spain. They'd want to get on the ships and go out and try to see if they could capture a Spanish galleon. That they would want to protect their country and fight for it. And that he was almost single-handedly crafting this history that they could be proud of.
That makes the most sense to me.
It was really quite a service that he was doing for her. Another thing he was doing, and by the way, Supreme Court Justice Stevens has that very clearly stated in his book, in his article. I don't think that he goes into another very important reason, but other historians have put this forth, that he was actually crafting a history to show that Elizabeth was legitimate to be to be the ruler and queen of England.
The rightful Tudor bloodline, right. The correct queen, the anointed queen chosen by God type of thing, right?
Yeah. Exactly. And that in crafting this history of England, that as he goes through the history plays, and we all know the Henry plays and the King Richard II, Richard III, but as he's crafting this, he's also managing to support the legitimacy of the Tudors to reign and to be the monarchs. And that was another very great service that he is doing for Elizabeth.
So it's $1 million marketing campaign.
Yes.
It's $1 million
It's
a year marketing campaign, and that's not so hard to absorb when you think about the amount of money that major corporations and even governments spend on marketing today. How that's not such a far cry.
no, he would be her administrator of propaganda. And he's really good. And how nice to have somebody doing this for you that's really quite good at it. She
Absolutely.
has Shakespeare, and she's paying him to do it. So that he could afford to put together these plays and get the people in costumes. And you're a theater director. You know how much time and effort and resources that takes to do.
I wish somebody would give me $1 million a year to do it. I'll write plays that send whatever message they want and market them however they want for $1 million a year. Bring it on.
Sure. Right. So at any rate, I realized that this £1,000 a year has not been looked at closely enough for how significant it is. And that was what my chapter 7 of my book was all about.
I think it's a great chapter, and I think it is a great issue that a lot of Stratfordians don't want to look at, that they don't want to admit that in order for somebody to be producing this work at the rate and the way it was produced required some sort of financial backing and the amount of time and energy necessary to make it happen, let alone the connections to the court and the people and the players involved in order to put all of that into the work of the propaganda machine.
You said it beautifully. Exactly.
The next chapter I'd like you to touch on is actually one of my favorites, and it's one of the first topics that you shared with me in our early acquaintance together, and it's the one about censorship and punishment in Elizabethan England. And for those people who were writing things that were not funded by the crown and not sanctioned by the queen and were to be held accountable. Tell us a little bit about that one.
Well, that's a great subject, and that's my chapter 4 in my book. One of the things that the English professors would like to tell you is that Mr. Shakespeare, in their mind, this man from Stratford, just wandered around. And one teacher once said, and I was shocked, that he wandered around with his little troupe of actors and they were doing cute things. I almost fell out of my seat in the class.
Cute things.
Cute things. Well, what they were really, I know, isn't that just shocking?
I hope no one ever accuses me as a theater artist of doing cute things. Oh, those cute things that Sable and his actors are doing.
Yeah. Well, what Shakespeare, whoever he was, and we think he was pretty sure that he's Oxford, but what he was doing is he was doing very dangerous things. And in order to understand just how dangerous it was to be a writer and be putting forth works that have an element of danger in them, you need to see what's happening to everybody else, and that's what my chapter 4 in my book is all about. For one thing, well, the real one of the most harsh punishments that happened. It happened to a man who sadly was appropriately named John Stubbs. He wrote a pamphlet. It was in around 1580, a little bit before the Spanish Armada was clamoring to attack them. He wrote a pamphlet, I think 1579 is the exact date, and he was he criticized a policy of William Cecil Lloyd Burleigh, and William Cecil Lloyd Burleigh had his hand cut off, and he had it, and the wound seared with a hot iron. This is really not very nice. He also had the publisher's hand cut off and seared with a hot iron.
That sounds like a scene out of Titus Andronicus to me.
It does. It could be, right?
Right. I mean, Titus has to give up his hand as ransom for his sons in Titus Andronicus. And I'm wondering if our guy isn't maybe giving a little bit of a tip of the hat to the punishment that was suffered by some of his fellow writers.
Well, I definitely think you can find some good reasons to think that he is doing that. Rather interestingly, when Stubbs recovered, the writer himself recovered, the publisher died. But when he recovered, he was taken into the household of our guy, Edward de Vere's sister, Mary de Vere, who had married Lord Willoughby. And he lived in her household, I believe, until he died. So it's kind of interesting that our guy would have been quite well aware of this punishment that happened to this particular writer, who criticized William Cecil Lord Burleigh, who was our guy's father-in-law, of all things.
Now, is it possible that Edward actually had a hand, pardon the pun, in the writing of this pamphlet that Stubbs puts his name on, and then when Stubbs suffers the penalty, Edward feels guilty, so he makes sure that Stubbs is cared for, and then writes Titus Andronicus as an homage to Stubbs?
Well, that would be an interesting scenario that somebody could pick up on. I can't speak to that here, but it's certainly an interesting scenario. And Edward de Vere, our guy, was certainly well aware of the punishment. There were other punishments that were visited on other writers. The one writer that we talk about a lot was Christopher Marlowe. Christopher Marlowe was doing very dangerous things, and I won't go into specifics because I think it's a little bit too much minutia, but everybody is well aware of the killing of Christopher Marlowe, Kit Marlowe, as he's often called, in the little town of Deptford, and it's a homicide. And of course, the conspiracy theorist, which I'm not, and we're not, would like to think that he actually lived and that this death was staged, but I don't think so. I actually think that it was a homicide, and Marlowe was taken out because Marlowe was doing dangerous things, and Marlowe really couldn't be controlled by the government, so he had to go. And I believe that he was quite dead as of May 30th in the year 1593.
There is evidence, isn't there, that Marlowe was working for Walsingham as a spy and perhaps even a double agent against France? Isn't there some historical evidence for that?
Yes. Well, Kit Marlowe was sent to Europe, and I can't give you the exact information right now, but Cecil Lord Burleigh wrote that he had missed his graduation from Cambridge. And there is a letter in the archives from Cecil Lord Burleigh saying that he was doing service for him, and so he should receive his degree from Cambridge. And of course, Cecil Lord Burleigh could do that because Cecil Lord Burleigh was the chancellor of Cambridge University. So that letter is extant. Exactly what he was doing when, I think there's a lot of speculation, but there's no question that he was performing for the government and for William Cecil, who had a network of spies that went back and forth across to the continent, to the Low Countries and to France. And and there's some documentation that Christopher Marlowe was connected to some of these people who were going back and forth and serving as spies. So he is thought to have been a spy. Why that could have led to his assassination, and I believe he was taken out deliberately. That's what I think, because he was a loose cannon.
Well, if you outlive your usefulness, you get a dagger in the eye. That's the way it works.
I could see that. Another interesting factor, though, is that Christopher Marlowe had a roommate, a man named Thomas Kidd, K-Y-D, is how it's generally spelled. And Kidd was arrested and imprisoned at Bridewell Prison and tortured. And the reason that he was tortured is they were trying to wring out of Thomas Kidd confessions about and testimony that Christopher Marlowe had been an atheist and whatever, things that they could actually build a case against Marlowe to go after Marlowe for. And at some point shortly after Marlowe's demise, Kidd is released, and then he died the next year. They think of having suffered the tortures that he had suffered when he was as a political prisoner in Bridewell Prison. Then we get to another individual whose name is Thomas Nash. Nash is another very prominent writer who initially was quite a favorite of the Elizabethan government. And then he gets into trouble, and he writes a play called The Isle of Dogs. And he writes his play along with Ben Jonson, who's just starting his career now. I'm going to hear a lot about Ben Jonson and the troubles that Ben Jonson has with Elizabethan authorities. Jonson can't get out of one predicament that could lead to his demise. As soon as he gets out of one, he jumps into the next problems with the government. But when he composed the play The Isle of Dogs in 1597 with Thomas Nash, they were both arrested. And rumor has it, and this is something that I spent a lot of time working on, Thomas Nash was imprisoned. And the person who was sent by Elizabethan government to question Nash and find out everything that they could about this play that was considered very seditious was the Queen's torturer, a man named Richard Topcliffe, a dangerous, dangerous man. And to be in Topcliffe's tender clutches was just not a very good place to be. It is said that Thomas Nash somehow escaped. I personally find that difficult to believe. I say that in the chapter of my book, but that's argumentative, and I try not to get into speculation.
So Topcliffe would have been the guy that when we're watching a movie of Renaissance times or even medieval times, and the guy comes in wearing the black hood and he has all these instruments, all these wicked looking metal instruments that do terrible things to people. That would have been Topcliffe.
It would have been, depending on your time frame, if you're late Elizabethan times, yes, it was Topcliffe.
Okay.
Because Topcliffe took pride in his instruments of torture, and he had permission from Queen Elizabeth to take people out of prison and bring them to his own home, where he had even more seriously horrible torture equipment that he could torture people with. He had Elizabeth's permission to do that, and he reported directly to Queen Elizabeth. Really a dangerous person to be involved with, not somebody he wanted to be on his bad side. And Thomas Nash definitely was not in his good graces. So,
well, when you refer to England as an Isle of Dogs, I think you're asking for it, right?
It could be. Historians don't know exactly. No copies of the Isle of Dogs survive. So historians don't know exactly what the Isle of Dogs was all about. There's a lot of speculation, but clearly it wasn't very nice and it wasn't very complimentary. And so Elizabeth called in her top torturer, namely Richard Topcliffe, to find out.
And then there had to be others who were then sent out to find every copy and destroy them. I mean, that's obvious reason why no copy exists then, right?
No question about it. Yes. It was rounded up. Whatever copies existed were rounded up and destroyed because posterity, namely us, we don't have them.
Right.
So it was a dangerous time to be a writer. And you might think that the people of England would be really upset about this and they would object to censorship. And by the way, there were laws on the books and that were repeatedly put on the books. And one of the laws way back in the 1580s was called the Statute of Silence. And it basically was meant to silence writers who went too far. If they were going to do something that was satire to write about people in positions of power in England, Elizabeth and her royal court, that it enumerated what could be done to punish them. And so that it had statutory power to go after writers and extract pretty harsh punishments.
I don't think modern audiences have a true understanding of the totalitarian nature of the Elizabethan government and governments of that time. I don't think they quite understand that level of censorship. Like, we rail against censorship today, but I don't think we really have a clue as to the full ramifications of being snatched off the street without anyone being able to say a thing about it, being thrown into a prison cell without any trial, any type of arraignment, anything whatsoever, being tortured to the point of death or even to death to extract information. I don't think we quite have a grasp of that in today's modern times.
We really don't. And in fact, thinking of Richard Topcliffe, just to give you another idea of what an evil person he was doing this, actually, Topcliffe and his people who worked for him actually had established their modus operandi, am I pronouncing that correctly, by going after Jesuit priests who were entering England especially in the 1580s as missionaries. They were trying to go back, and they went into homes of people who were Catholic and who tried to protect them. And they went to different headquarters that were called Catholic chaplaincies, where they come in, they were smuggled into England, and Topcliffe and his band of merry hatchet men located them, found them, arrested them, and then Topcliffe tortured them, and to get more information about where more priests were hiding, and then they were executed. And a lot of them were found out and executed, tortured first, and then executed. And it was really a pretty serious thing.
And there are some historical buildings still in England today that have priest hides built into them. Areas where they were like a concealed compartment where they could stuff a priest inside the wall or inside the floorboard or in the attics in order to hide them. They called them priest hides, and those still exist today.
Yes, they do. And I have an interesting book for you that's almost impossible to find. And I bring it with me because it was in my mother's collection. Mother was able to get her hands on some things that I think the book has now totally disappeared. It's written by a man named Granville Squires. And this may sound like minutia, but I promise you it's really important. In the earlier part of the 20th century, Squires went around and he to all the old homes, and people said, I'm living in a home that was built in 1550 or whatever, these old manor homes that are still extant. And he examined them, what they thought was a priest hide. And the whole book is built, some he eliminated, saying, no, this was a more recent construct. But he actually authenticated priest hides. And this whole book, which is now almost impossible to find unless it's been republished, I'll check it out because it's extraordinarily interesting that so many Catholic families were really, back then, were trying to hide the priests. And Topcliffe and the other government officials would go raid their homes, and they would stake out the homes where it was rumored that priests were hiding, and they go in and they rip up floorboards, just like you said, looking for the priest hides. And they can still be found. And so far as I know, this book, which is now a very rare book, is the last word and that authenticates and is generally considered to be a very accurate account of the priest hides that existed back then that are still extant.
It gives you images of Diary of Anne Frank in your mind. It's that kind of same type of system and situation going on, just a different religion that was under threat at the time.
Absolutely. Every bit of what you're saying. And it's chilling for us to think about it. I have another little chilling factoid that most people don't know yet. I will get it into a book sooner or later. Edward de Vere lived the last 10 years of his life in a country manor home outside of London called King's Place. And it's an interesting story about this home, King's Place, which unfortunately was destroyed in bombing in World War II. What was so badly beaten up in the bombings that it was ultimately taken out and dismantled. But King's Place had been one of these headquarters for the Jesuits to come in and hide and be hidden at King's Place. And after Edward de Vere moved in, and we have that date, his second wife purchased the home with her own from her own resources. After he moved in, it was never raided again. That's something most people don't know.
That's an interesting fact. I'd love to see more details about that. That's a great new one to put together for another book, for another presentation at another conference.
Another day, another time. Yes.
Yeah, that's a fabulous story. I wonder if he used the old priest hides as manuscript hides,
It would be wonderful and it's sort of everybody's dream. It's the gold star of the gold mine that we all are looking at.
Just one page in his own writing from one play, right? Yeah, that's, of course, what we all would love to have. But when you have a power like the Cecil family, because it wasn't just William, but his son Robert carried on the family tradition of that type of totalitarian censorship. When you have the ability to destroy every copy of something that has been published, it's not far-fetched that we don't have what we're looking for, and maybe we'll never find exactly what we're looking for that very reason.
I agree with that, and it's really, it's as I do a lot of talks, talk to a lot of people about this, and give talks at community groups around and about Houston and other places, and it's hard for people to get their heads around how little there really is. They think, I've had people tell me, "Oh, Bonner, you could just get the letters that Mr. Shakespeare in their mind wrote, and get manuscripts that whoever he is, but in their mind, Manfred Stratford wrote, and you compare the handwritings, and you've got your guy." And that would seem to make sense. And it's impossible. Well, it's hard, not impossible, but difficult for them to get their heads around the fact that there are no letters from the man from Stratford, and there are no manuscripts from anybody. There aren't even, with one single exception, there is only one page of one manuscript of a Shakespeare play that is extant in the handwriting of somebody. And it's one page of Titus Andronicus that is signed by a writer of the time whose name was Henry Peacham. You know about the Peacham document. Titus Andronicus. With a cute little illustration up at the front, up at the top of the page. And that's it. And that is, so far as I know, and as far as the record has in it, the only copy, and that's a copy in somebody's handwriting that's identifiable from the time frame of late Elizabethan Jacobean time. And that's odd because a lot of plays were copied of other writers. People couldn't buy the book, or couldn't afford the book. They could at least get somebody to copy it out in somebody's handwriting. It might not be authorial, the author's own handwriting, but it'd be somebody's handwriting. And we don't even have any of that, of these Shakespeare plays. And there's a lot of plays. The 36 plays in the first folio, and more in the Shakespeare Apocrypha, as it's called, plus Pericles, plus a few. But at any rate, it's uncanny and we have a few letters of the time where somebody has attended a play and writes a little bit about it. Simon Foreman's diaries have a little bit about Macbeth, I think. And another man named Edward Pudsey was the theater goer, and he wrote a little bit something about Othello. And so, but it's just amazing how little there is of these works, which are just so magnificent.
It's not just uncanny, it's unparalleled. There's no other instance like this of any other writer or of any other collection of works that I'm aware of throughout printed word history.
I would agree with that, especially when one considers the magnitude of the Shakespeare canon, just the sheer number of words on paper. And of course, as we know from the will of the man from Stratford, he didn't own a book. He didn't have diaries. He didn't have letters. Now, Oxford had letters. We have 77 of his letters in his own handwriting extant. And something else that I've done, although this isn't in my book, Necessary Mischief, I have been working on collating the vocabulary and the phrases from Oxford's letters, most particularly what they're called the 10 letters, and correlating those into words and phrases and vocabulary in the Shakespeare canon. And strangely enough, amazingly, or it shouldn't be amazing, it's easy to do.
The 10 letters, that's when he's requesting a preferment, as we talked about earlier in the episode, where he's requesting a preferment from the Queen. He wants a monopoly on the tin trade, right?
Exactly. And the Queen won't give it to him. And he could have made money on that.
Well, tin was a very useful commodity in making steel. So, and steel's very important when you've got wars to fight.
And alloys, yes. And also, it was a tremendous export. That tin was being shipped all over the known world through the Mediterranean Sea. And the middlemen, and it's interesting because Oxford, and we have these letters, they're extant. They're in his handwriting. This isn't any speculation. He was seeing in that what was going on from the people who were mining the tin, the poor miners who were at the bottom of the barrel, the bottom of the strata of the hierarchy, and the middlemen were ripping off the Queen. The Queen was supposed to be getting some money out of this, but she's not getting adequately paid. The poor people at the bottom who are actually doing the hard work aren't getting adequately paid. Needless to say, nothing new in that. But the people in the middle, the different middlemen who are handling all of this stuff, they're just reveling in money and wealth. And Oxford's reporting that to the Queen. And he's indicating initially that he thinks he could exert himself to help straighten it out, but she won't give him the chance. She does not give him the monopoly to do it. So, but he tries.
That would have been, he would have been too busy with that. She didn't want him doing that. She wanted him to continue creating her propaganda machine. She wanted him to not be distracted by industry of that nature that would have called upon him to immerse himself in that type. I mean, we should all be grateful that she didn't grant him that, because he wouldn't have had time to keep writing these plays.
That's a very good reason for why she might have denied him that preferment. That, yeah, it's.
I mean, that's a huge trade to have to be in charge of and to be responsible for and run, and especially if he's going in with a reform attitude. Like, certainly that makes sense to me why she went, no, I don't want you busying yourself with that. I don't care if that's costing me money. I need you doing what I'm paying you to do.
That makes all kinds of sense. Yes. That as to why she denied him the tin monopoly when he tried hard to get her.
Oh yeah, he tried real hard. Like, and he writes all of these, I glory, and then at the end he gets angry about it, and he actually I think he risks getting himself in trouble by basically calling her out and saying, "Why won't you give this to me?"
There is one of the letters that it's been archived in the Huntington Library in this country. It's part of the Egerton series. And I wanted to give, if I can give a plug to my mother. My mother discovered the letters and the thousands and thousands of documents and letters. It had been cataloged as tin mining Cornwall. Isn't that great? Who would look at tin mining in Cornwall was what Cornwall was doing. But this particular, several letters, I think there are 8 now in that particular series. And one of them is a letter that he wrote directly to the Queen. It's 4 pages. And what this letter should be it should be in every history book that deals with Queen Elizabeth, because he is basically fussing at Queen Elizabeth. He's telling her, in effect, you're getting ripped off. And he's saying it in no uncertain terms. And he's adamant about it. And he tries occasionally to put a little phrase, if your majesty is, would agree to, would look at this. He's trying to, sometimes it softens a little bit, but basically he's just in a rant about how she's getting ripped off by the monopoly, well, he wants the monopoly, but the other people who've had the tin mining and had access to this wealth that's coming out of this all this tin industry. And it's amazing that a subject would be able to so openly talk to the Queen, write to the Queen in this sort of tone.
I think that letter needs to be compared with other letters from other members of court of equal standing in its use of that type of language, and to see who else in her inner circle felt so familiar with her that they could use that kind of language in writing to her directly. And I'm wondering if there isn't evidence there in looking at that no one else or very few others in the circle felt that comfortable, that familiar with her, that they could risk her wrath by writing to her in that way and using that kind of language.
That would be a wonderful topic, because as I have read bits and pieces, I haven't done the whole comprehensive of correspondence that's published, that's been written to Elizabeth, but in bits and pieces, they published letters. Most everybody, like her favorites, Sir Christopher Hatton, who was her Lord Chancellor, he was always incredibly obsequious to her. William Cecil Lord Burleigh was always very careful in how he addressed her. And he tells Robert, he's instructing Robert, people were extremely obsequious and just fell all over themselves to address her in ways that were the most generous and the most praiseworthy.
She holds the power of life and death in her hand. She literally can say, off with their head, and it will happen. So yeah, I could see where you would be afraid to address her in any way other than to be a subject of her royal majesty.
That I feel certain that what you're just saying can be backed up, but it does need to be, and to my knowledge, no one has ever done this, to put forth, to have all of the letters, to be as comprehensive as we possibly can. The letters that came to her from the Earl of Essex, and the letters that came from the Earl of Leicester, the letters that came from Sir Walter Raleigh. These were people that were in her circle that she gave a lot of stuff to. She gave them a lot of preferments. In fact, it was Walter Raleigh that ultimately gets the monopoly on tin. And they were very and I keep using the word obsequious for lack of a better word coming into my head right now, but they couldn't have been more falling all, as I said, just coming up with more that they could think of to flatter her. They were, and in just the almost sickening, sycophantic sort of ways. To say they were
Caesar loves flattery, and when you tell him that he does not, he is even further flattered. I'm paraphrasing the line from Julius Caesar, but I can't help but think that was just one of his little digs at her when he talks. When I think it's Trebonius is the character who says, "Oh, I'll go to Caesar and I'll take care of this," because he loves to be flattered. But when you tell him that he doesn't love to be flattered, he's even more flattered.
Yes. Well, it would be a really good paper for someone to write, and actually that someone should be me, because I have the 10 letters, and I have them both in their original in Oxford's handwriting that my mother had obtained when she found them. She obtained them through permission of the Huntington, and I'd have to go back and get permission again to publish them, but they do need to be published, and particularly that letter where he is directly writing to Queen Elizabeth. He calls her Your Majesty. When he's writing about her, he calls her Her Majesty. When he's writing to Egerton, who was at this point one of the most important people in her royal administration. But this one letter, he's clearly writing to her because he calls her over and over, Your Majesty. And the way and the tone in which he is addressing her has to be completely, again, I'm searching for words here. I could have.
It happens in conversation.
Yeah. But I should be more diametrically opposed to the way everybody else addresses her in her circle, which is basically the people who get to address the Queen. Normal people don't get to send an email to her in their Twitter account.
Right. I take great pride, actually, in the fact that just about every episode we do with each guest that we have in the episode, I make some sort of suggestion to them about a future project that they should endeavor upon, and they tend to cleave to it. And so I'm glad to be a source of inspiration, but I myself would love to see side-by-side comparisons of letters to Her Majesty and the use of language and the tone of those letters, and see what differences there are, and see if this is just one other way our guy gets away with something that nobody else would have dared to even do.
And still is getting paid his $1,000.
And still getting his $1 million a year to continue. Yeah. Because when you look at the works of Shakespeare, we touched about how dangerous it was to be a writer underneath her era and her age, unless she's paying you to write. When you look at the works of Shakespeare, yes, they do exactly what we've said they do. They rewrite English history. They legitimize her position on the throne. The Tudor dynasty is glorified and reinforced through the works. But there are also many portions of many of the plays that specifically stab at, and I use that term on purpose because obviously the death of Polonius comes to mind in Hamlet, particularly stab at the highest ranking members of court. But yet there is no record, as far as I'm aware, and I know your research would have come up with this, no record of a William Shakespeare or a William Shakespeare of any kind ever being arrested, ever being called in for questioning, ever being tortured for anything that is published under that name.
There is nothing, and that is shocking. And it's something that the English professors really can't explain, and especially if you throw in their face the context of what happens to everybody else and what Shakespeare, whoever he is, of course, we're really pretty sure we know who he is, but what he is doing,
I'm sure.
what he's doing in Richard II, what he's doing in Richard III. Richard III is modeled on Robert Cecil, and Lord Robert was a pretty scary person. Robert was in fact, when Robert died, after he died, according to historians, the venomous. People just started to write horrible things about him. And as one of the historians says, they were scared of him when he and his spies when he lived. So the vitriol that comes at Robert Cecil Cecil after he died is just it's amazing, because people really hated Robert Cecil, because Robert Cecil could come after them very effectively. And here is Shakespeare, whoever he is, lampooning him as the terrible villainous Richard III. Now, and the Hunchback Richard III, which is something else that Robert Cecil Cecil. And forgive me for saying Cecil Cecil. Cecil, when I say that, people don't really hone in on the name when it's correctly pronounced Cecil.
You say tomato, I say tomato. Whatever.
But you know what I'm talking about. But the general public will hear this. It needs to be firm in their mind who I'm speaking about. But Robert Cecil was such a dangerous person to come after. He would come after people. So why in the world did he not come after Shakespeare when Shakespeare puts him on the public stage looking like a real villainous person?
Well, one reason would be if Shakespeare is not a real person, but a pseudonym. The other reason being if the name behind the pseudonym is protected because he's the second oldest title in all of English history, the 17th Earl of Oxford, surrounded, by the way, a lot of people don't realize this. They hear these numbers and I don't think they really get context there, that 17th means 17 men in history successively holding this title, dating back to William the Conqueror himself. It's not like, the third Earl of this or the fourth Earl of that. And this guy's surrounded by a lot of those guys. No one else holds that rank and position like our guy. Nobody can trace their family lineage back that far of anyone surrounding him during the time of the age.
That's absolutely correct. The antiquity of that title and that earldom is an amazing thing. And what makes it really amazing is this is another very strange anomaly. When Edward de Vere died, and we understand from history that he died on June 24th of 1604. Okay, that's swell. Not one single person wrote in any letter, in any sort of way that we have today, an acknowledgement that Edward de Vere died. And given the antiquity of his lineage, and just how it didn't matter if he did wonderfully amazing things in his life, it just mattered that he was an earl who represented this incredible length and title that was so incredibly significant in the history of England, and that when he died, nobody notices, nobody writes a blooming thing. And I went through the Cecil papers. This is something no one else has done, and I haven't written on it. But I went through the Cecil papers and I used word search. Nobody wrote to Robert Cecil, who is his brother-in-law, in 1604 and said, well, aren't we glad you're finally rid of this guy? He was nothing but a thorn in your side.
The way he treated your sister, the way he treated your father, none of that. Yeah, nothing.
Nothing is in the Cecil papers. Now, the paper, somehow or another, those papers have been stripped. They've been cleansed, sanitized.
Well, Robert Cecil was the great cleaner.
He was a very great, yes.
Yes, the little hunchback, the little imp, I believe, is what Elizabeth was fond of calling him, right? Was her little imp. She was the only one who could get away with that kind of thing because she was the queen. But anyone else who used that kind of terminology with him, I'm certain paid a terrible, terrible price for it.
I would imagine so. Because, and in fact, for Shakespeare, whoever he is, to caricature his father, William Cecil, as Polonius in Hamlet is just something that should have been the end of whoever wrote Hamlet.
And for him to be killed for spying, which we know for a fact is something that Edward had a huge problem with his father-in-law about, that he even wrote to him directly about. And those letters are in existence. And we do have those letters where he says to his father-in-law, I don't want to be spied on by you. Stop spying on me. And then it shows up in Hamlet. And what does Hamlet do? Kills Polonius, who's hiding behind the arras, spying. I mean, that connection right there is one of the ones that I think anybody with any kind of a brain can immediately wrap their brain around. But then when you add your research to it and we reveal that this is something that should have been punishable, but no one was punished for it, that I think is the giant red flag, the big elephant in the room, and nobody wants to acknowledge the pile of peanut shells that continues to grow around us.
Yes, I totally agree. It's funny that in the book called Contested Will that James Shapiro, who is a professor at Columbia University, he tries to lord over us his great eminence, but which is a matter of what I like to call the argument from eminence versus the argument from evidence.
He's the Robert Cecil of the Stratfordian movement today, in my mind.
And he writes, I do have this in one of the chapters, in my book about the censorship, that, no, it's in the first chapter, excuse me, where I'm talking about his book, Contested Will. But he says that we show a small grasp of Elizabethan censorship that had the man from Stratford, he's using some sort of peculiar, circuitous, circular reasoning, that if he had actually been caricaturing William Cecil Lord Burleigh, he would have been rounded up. Well, yes, except that he, the Stratford man, wasn't the one doing the caricaturing. And that is something that Shapiro, among others, they have a real hard time with. And the problem with that is that the bottom line, historians understand and accept. Some of the finest historians, English historians of the 20th century, realize, and it's a done deal, that Polonius in Hamlet is modeled on William Cecil Lord Burleigh.
I don't think that there can be any question about that whatsoever, knowing what we know about the man, knowing what we know about his personal writings and his precepts, which are also lampooned in the play, you know, neither a borrower nor a lender be. Everybody knows that quote, part of that big diatribe that he delivers to Laertes before sending him off to Paris. And we know for a fact that William, before sending off his son, not Robert, the other son, and I can't think of his name. Thomas. Before sending Thomas Cecil off to where? Paris. He writes in this letter full of very similar precepts. Those correlations can't be denied. And again, it just comes down to who would have known, who would have had access to that, who was raised under William Cecil as if it was his own stepdad and then became his own father-in-law. Edward de Vere, of course.
Yes. There are two questions. One is, how would anybody who wasn't actually in William Cecil's household know some of these very private family things? How would he know? Which, of course, Oxford knows. And the other question is, how could he get away with it? Who could have gotten away with it other than Edward de Vere? And it's something else that in my chapter 7, I have put forth, and I think I've never had anybody contradict me on this, which I gather I'm kind of a little bit influential in getting people to agree with this. But I believe that with that £1,000 a year, Queen Elizabeth was giving Oxford not only the money and the means to do what he was doing, but she was giving him immunity and indemnification to do whatever it was he was doing, to say, hands off my boy. As long as I'm okay with what he's doing, Oxford is not to be touched.
He had a license. He had a license from the Queen.
Yes.
And I think a big part of that is because she loved the theater as much as he did. And she loved the plays as much as we do. She loved when he poked at William, when he poked at Robert, when he poked at Christopher Hatton, when he poked even at one of her favorites, Leicester. She laughed as much as anyone. In fact, probably much to the chagrin of those members of court who had to sit there and grin and bear it because the Queen was laughing.
She had to have loved it. It's a question that I get asked sometimes is, okay, then why is she letting him, when you start talking about all the satire, people in her close circle of associates, and I don't want to say friends, because I don't know that she regarded anybody as exactly a friend, but she certainly was extremely fond of William Cecil, Lord Burleigh, and she was extremely fond of Christopher Hatton, and he's Malvolio in Twelfth Night, and of course, one of the things in Merry Wives that I've just been studying as part of a talk that I gave recently, Sir Philip Sidney is slender because Oxford thinks he's pretty slender-witted, but and Leicester is just as shallow. However, she loved the Earl of Leicester. One thing that I am certain of, the love of Elizabeth's life was Robert Dudley, the Earl of Leicester, who she made the Earl of Leicester, and she cared about some of these people cared deeply about the Earl of Leicester, and yet Shakespeare is poking fun at them in pretty non-pleasant ways if you're that person. So why did she let him do it? And how did he get away with it? Well, all I can think of is that Elizabeth actually had a mean streak. She treated people pretty badly.
She enjoyed it. She enjoyed the roasting.
It was a roasting, just exactly. It was like the press corps the presidential press corps that meet, and the Rotary roastings of clubs, and I use Saturday Night Live.
It was her favorite form of entertainment. We know that she loved music, and we know that she loved to dance. But as she grew older, she couldn't do those very well anymore. But what she could still do was sit in the audience and watch and laugh. And nobody understood the inside jokes better than her. He was writing in many ways for all of England, but also in many ways for an audience of one. His best patron, his $1 million a year patron.
That is exactly the way I think it was going. It was working out.
I think when you look at the plays, he was
writing with in mind.
When you look at the plays with those glasses on, so much of them that would otherwise not make any sense suddenly makes perfect and clear sense. That the author knew that the Queen herself was going to be seeing these performances. And that was his first number one goal, was to entertain her. Sometimes I think to speak directly to her, to try to encourage her, persuade her, advise her in his own way. And secondary was the audience of England.
I agree. One of the things that has been a lot of speculation and is becoming a little bit more of a bone of contention, as I think we're becoming more, from our point of view, the Oxfordians are being more persuasive as to who was the audience for these plays. Through the centuries, these so-called Shakespearean authorities have always, or for the most part, taken the position that these were plays for the common stage and the common people. To which I would say, now I do believe that the history plays were primarily meant to go out to the public and be presented to the public. But the tragedies and the comedies were much more closely held. Take, for example, Love's Labour's Lost. I would sure like to know how ordinary people could make heads or tails out of Love's Labour's Lost.
Oh, I don't think you can. And I think, other plays that we do have the very first reference of a historical performance, many of them are court performances or performed at the inns of court. One that specifically comes to mind that I really love is Othello. Othello's first recorded performance occurs during the wedding festivities of Philip Herbert and Susan de Vere. That play is never recorded as ever being performed prior to that season, and that season's big ado was that wedding. And it's not the only Shakespeare play performed during that season, too. There's a whole list of them that are performed as part of the festivities for that particular wedding. But there's just one example that the plays definitely were written for an audience of the elite to begin with.
And I'll augment what you've just said. In fact, I'll send you the record of that in an email after this is over, because it was in my talk that I gave at Ashland, not this past Ashland seminar, but last year. And I have it out of a Shakespeare Authorities book. That Measure for Measure was another play that we noted the first performance of came the day, I want to say either the day after the marriage of Philip Herbert and Susan Vere, who's Edward de Vere's daughter. Yes, that wedding, that season of performances and that particular wedding, which was the highlight event of the season, and that coincides with the first performances and other performances, enormous number of performances of Shakespeare plays. And I will send you that. You probably already have it, but I'll send you another copy of it.
Please do.
look
No,
at
please.
it.
I look forward to that. Measure for Measure is one of those problem plays, they call it. And I think that it suddenly is not a problem play when you look at the imprisonment of Edward de Vere and Anne Vavasour and their illegitimate baby. And you look at it under those terms, then you see that Measure for Measure is a message to the Queen saying basically this: everyone's doing it. I just got caught. And when you look at the play in that perspective, suddenly it's not a problem comedy anymore. It's not a problem play anymore. It's a play with a specific message to a sovereign saying, you're punishing me for something that everybody else is doing. I just happened to get the girl pregnant, and so I got busted.
Mm-hmm. Isn't it amazing how much clarification comes once you understand who the author is?
Isn't that true about every author and their works? I mean, I use this reference all the time. Twain is a great one, obviously, but one of my favorites is Poe. Once you know the life of Poe, all of his work becomes crystal clear. The amount of suffering and loss and death that man had to endure and go through, it's no wonder he wrote all of these dark, macabre pieces. Then when you tie in his morphine addiction, and the weird visions he must have had under the influence of that drug, suddenly Poe makes clear, perfect sense. Otherwise, it's just weird.
Definitely. And I feel that there's so much that we have just a gold mine that has not been explored by what we call the orthodox scholars, the Shakespeare professors that stand in their high ivory towers and lecture to us about and really want to make fun of us and put us down, when in fact we're the ones that are really illuminating what went on historically, how it works with the plays, what the plays mean, and you can't do it, but they're almost forbidden from doing it because they are forbidden from acknowledging that the Stratford narrative is not true. It's fictitious, which is another issue as to why this particular false narrative was put in place. And that's something, by the way, that I'm going to be discussing. And I have discussed it at Ashland, and you heard my talk then. And I'm going to be putting that out forth at the conference in Hartford, Connecticut.
The conference in Hartford has sort of a slight theme happening to it. And I think part of that is because it's happening at the Mark Twain House and Museum. And obviously the most famous pseudonym in American literature is that pseudonym. But there is a slight theme that is starting to develop there for the conference about pseudonyms, the use of pseudonyms, pseudonymous writing. I actually said it right this time. I have a hard time with that word, pseudonymous. Pseudonymous writing. And I'm looking forward to further developments in that area and in hearing the presentations on that topic. And of course, listeners will be able to then eventually view those presentations because the Shakespeare Oxford Fellowship will be video recording them and then putting them up on YouTube. If you're interested in seeing some of Bonner's presentations, she has some YouTube videos up there as well where you can see her deliver not live, recorded, but you can see her face and hear her delivering some of the things that you'll find also in her book. The book is called Necessary Mischief, Exploring the Shakespeare Authorship Question. You can find it on Amazon, which is where I purchased my copy, as well as other fine book retailers. And Bonner, we want to thank you so much for joining us for this episode. It's been such a wonderful pleasure talking to you again and having you here on Don't Quill the Messenger.
Well, thank you so much, Stephen. It's been great fun. It's always wonderful to talk to you. You have such a wonderful way of just enlivening everything every subject that you touch, and we're so pleased that to have your voice is part of our voices.
Well, you are sweet and kind, and I appreciate the praise. I will accept it wholeheartedly with great thanks and gratitude. I look forward to seeing you at the next conference, and we'll catch up then. Thanks again for being here, Bonner.
Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, be sure to download all of our other episodes. You can visit don'tquillthepodcast.com, don'tquillthepodcast.com to find all of your favorite episodes and maybe some that you weren't aware even existed. More episodes to come every 2 weeks, every other Wednesday. Find a new one. be sure to visit our store and buy your Killer Quiller swag. Thanks, Quillers. Don't forget, keep asking questions.
If you've enjoyed today's episode, please leave a rating and review in your podcast player. For even more, visit our website, don'tquillthepodcast.com. There you can find official merchandise in our shop, as well as a link to our Patreon. This show is made possible by people like you. We hope you'll consider showing your support by becoming a monthly patron, where you'll receive bonus material and tons of exclusive perks. You can also join in the conversation on our Discord and by following us at Don't Quill the Pod on all social media. All of this can be found at don'tquillthepodcast.com, don'tquillthepodcast.com.
It's Dragon Wagon.